welcome to the Deep Dive. We're diving into the history of distributed learning today. How did we get to where we are? It's a pretty wild ride, actually.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story.
So we've got excerpts from a book. It's an academic book. 3 PhDs got together and wrote about how this whole field evolved.
Yeah.
And we're going to unpack it for you.
Really, it's about how technology and the way we understand learning have kind of grown up together.
Exactly. And we're going to focus on everything that's happened since, like, the 1980s. When personal computers and the internet hit the scene, that's when things really took off.
It's true.
Now, you might think distributed learning is this recent thing, but actually, one of the earliest examples of adaptive learning was a mechanical thingamajig.
Oh, what?
Yeah, a contraption. They called it Saki,
Saki.
short for the self-adaptive keyboard instructor.
Okay.
It helped people learn to type faster.
Really?
Yeah, gets all the way back to the 1930s.
Wow. That's even before computers, right?
Way before. But get this.
Yep.
It actually cut learning time in half.
No kidding.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
So personalized learning, it's been around longer than we think.
For sure. And when computers started showing up in schools in the 80s, that's when we saw this shift.
From what to what?
From boxes of books to computer-based learning,
Oh.
One of the early pioneers was this project called Plato.
Plato.
Yeah, out of the University of Illinois.
Okay.
It was one of the first big computer-based education systems. And really, it kind of set the stage for the online learning platforms that we're using today.
So Plato was like the granddaddy of online courses.
Yeah, kind of. Around the same time, we also saw computer-assisted instruction emerging, or CAI.
CAI.
It relied a lot on drill and practice, like repetition,
Like drilling those multiplication tables.
Exactly. It worked okay.
Yeah.
But researchers were already trying to push things further.
What do you mean?
Well, they were starting to develop intelligent tutoring systems, or ICE,
Okay.
in the 80s already.
Yeah.
Think of systems like Sherlock Lisp Tutor and Sophie. These were early attempts at using AI in education to make instruction more personalized and give better feedback.
That's so cool. They were already messing with AI back then in education.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder how far we've come and where we're going.
Totally. And these early ITS systems, they really paved the way for the even more sophisticated personalized learning we see today.
Right.
And while all this tech stuff was happening, there were also these important changes in the learning theories themselves.
Oh, right. It wasn't just about the tech. It was about figuring out how people learn best.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The 80s saw this move away from just behaviorism,
Yeah.
to more cognitive science approaches to learning.
Okay.
One big example, John Sweller's cognitive load theory.
Cognitive load theory.
Ever heard of it?
No, not really.
It basically highlights how limited our working memory is. We can only process so much info at a time.
Right. Makes sense.
So it's about managing that cognitive load during learning.
So not just cramming in info, but structuring it so our brains can actually handle it.
Exactly. And then you had Benjamin Bloom. He was looking at the impact of personalized instruction. His research showed that students who got one-on-one tutoring did way better than those in a traditional classroom. This is known as Bloom's 2 sigma problem.
2 sigma problem. Interesting. So individualized attention really does make a difference. It's like having a personal trainer, but for learning.
Haha. I like that analogy. And while a lot of the focus was on individual learning, the 80s also saw this rise of constructivist learning theories.
Okay, I've heard of that. What's that about again?
It emphasizes how important social interaction is and collaboration for learning.
So learning by doing and learning with others.
Exactly. Which led to the development of computer-supported collaborative learning.
Whoa, that's a mouthful.
Yeah, it is CSCL for short. Basically using tech to make it easier for people to learn together even when they're not in the same place.
So like online forums, shared documents, all
Yeah.
those tools we use now.
Exactly. Early examples of this were systems like Xerox's note cards and Carnegie Mellon's Andrews system.
Never heard of those.
These platforms let people share info and work together on projects. They were kind of the forerunners to all the collaborative online learning we have now.
So cool how they were pushing the boundaries back then.
One of the big names in this area was Marlene Scartamalia.
Sartamalia.
Yeah. She developed something called CSIL.
CSIL.
Stands for Computer Supported Intentional Learning Environment.
Catchy.
I know, right? It was more than just sharing info, though students could actually build knowledge together through discussions and projects. It was groundbreaking for social learning tech.
Sounds like the ancestor of virtual classrooms and all the online collaborative spaces we have now.
Absolutely. Speaking of virtual classrooms, star Roxanne Hiltz had this vision of a learning environment that wasn't limited by walls.
Yeah.
You know?
So learning anytime, anywhere through tech.
Yeah, that was the idea. She was a pioneer, worked at the New Jersey Institute of Technology.
Cool.
Way ahead of her time.
It's wild to think how these early visionaries shaped the future of learning.
Totally. And Hiltz's vision went beyond just copying a classroom online. She saw the potential of virtual worlds and synthetic environments, you
Yes.
know, like creating totally new learning experiences.
So like stepping into a whole new dimension of learning.
Exactly. And this brings us to another exciting development in the 80s, the birth of VR and AR.
Oh, wow. Virtual and augmented reality.
Yeah, although they were still pretty basic back then, like Michael Nymark. He used laser discs to make these virtual tours. He called it surrogate travel.
So like a super early version of Google Street View.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And
NASA, they were working on VR systems to train astronauts.
Really?
Yeah, using head-mounted displays and data gloves to create these immersive simulations.
So even back then, they were already using immersive tech for learning.
Oh, yeah. And then there was Habitat. This early attempt at a big multi-user virtual world might seem clunky now, but it gave a glimpse into the future of social interaction and learning online.
The early days of online gaming and virtual worlds.
Exactly. And while all this was happening in education, the training industry was getting in on the action too. You know, organizations like NASA and the military, they were really exploring the potential of tech for training.
Makes sense. Simulation would be huge for them. What were some of the big breakthroughs back then?
One of the most important was DARPA's SimNet, the simulation network launched in '87.
SimNet. Okay.
It connected a bunch of simulators together over a network, so trainees could participate in these complex collaborative simulations.
So like pilots in different locations flying together in a simulation?
Exactly. It was a huge step forward for distributed simulation-based training. And then as we get into the 90s, boom, the internet explodes, and everything changes for distributed learning.
So the 90s were like a turning point, taking everything to a whole new level.
Yeah, they were.
I'm ready for the next chapter. Let's dive into the 90s. The 90s and the internet. It's like everything changed practically overnight.
It really did. It was a total game changer for distributed learning. The internet made all these learning resources accessible to anyone with a computer and a modem. It's pretty amazing when you think about it. Suddenly a whole world of knowledge was right there.
Right there at your fingertips.
Yeah.
It's hard to even imagine now. What was it like before the internet was everywhere?
I know, right? It's like trying to explain life before smartphones.
Totally. And all that connectivity led to this boom in the e-learning industry.
It did. We saw the rise of course management systems, you know, CMS. And those eventually morphed into the learning management systems. We call them LMSs now.
LMS, yeah.
The platforms that deliver and manage online courses. Basically, it made learning more accessible and way more flexible.
So from those early computer-based learning experiments in the 80s, we jumped to this whole new level of online learning.
Yeah, and it wasn't just about recreating a classroom online. Researchers were starting to figure out how to use the web to make learning more engaging, you know?
And personalized. This is where we see adaptive hypermedia coming in. Adaptive hypermedia. That sounds kind of techy. What is that exactly?
Okay, so think of a regular website. Same content for everyone, right? Doesn't matter who you are or what you know.
Right.
Adaptive hypermedia. It's different. It actually tailors the info and how you move through it based on you.
Based on me.
Yeah, like your background, what you already know, how you're learning.
So it's like a website that knows what I need to learn. That's pretty wild.
It is, and one of the key people behind this was Peter Brusilovsky.
Brusilovsky.
His research was all about creating systems that could adapt to each learner.
So like a personal guide through all the chaos of online info.
Exactly. Leads you to the stuff that's most relevant and engaging for you.
I like it. And while adaptive hypermedia was doing its thing, intelligent tutoring systems, they were also evolving.
Oh, yeah. We talked about those early ITS from the 80s, but in the 90s, they got a serious upgrade.
Did they actually start making a real difference in how people learn?
They did. A great example is Ken Codinger's cognitive tutors.
Cognitive tutors.
These systems used some pretty fancy algorithms to personalize instruction and feedback for students learning math.
Okay.
And the results, they were pretty amazing.
So it wasn't just theory. They actually used these in classrooms.
Yeah, in thousands of schools across the U.S., and they saw significant improvements in how much students were learning. It was proof that AI could actually personalize learning and make a difference.
That's huge. And it feels like all these different research threads were coming together.
Right, like we're weaving a tapestry.
Uh-huh, yeah. And then in the 90s, we also see this new area emerge, effective computing.
Effective computing.
Yeah, it's about computers understanding and responding to human emotions.
Oh, wow. So like a computer that knows if you're getting frustrated or bored.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Imagine a learning system that not only teaches you, but also gets how you're feeling and adjusts what it's doing.
That's pretty mind-blowing.
I know, right? Could be so helpful for learners,
Yeah.
especially those who don't do well with traditional teaching.
Totally. Researchers started developing these things called pedagogical agents. Basically animated characters in learning systems.
Like a little virtual buddy.
Haha,
Like
kind
a-
of. They could express emotions and react to the learner's emotions too.
So it's like having a virtual tutor who not only knows the stuff, but also cares how you're feeling.
Uh-huh.
Makes it more human.
Exactly. And then there's Richard Mayle,
Layer.
a big name in educational psychology. He developed this thing called multimedia learning theory.
Okay.
It was all about giving practical guidelines for designing good multimedia learning experiences.
With the internet taking off, multimedia was everywhere in learning, right? So it was important to figure out how to use it effectively.
Exactly. Mayer's theory. It drew on Sweller's cognitive load theory and other ideas about how our brains work to optimize how we use text, images, audio, video, all that stuff. It was super important because it helped turn complex science into practical advice that teachers and instructional designers could actually use.
So taking all that brain science and applying it to how we design learning materials
Yeah. Especially with the internet exploding with multimedia.
makes sense. And the 90s also saw this huge growth in computer-mediated communication.
CMC.
Researchers were studying how people interact online. And that had big implications for online learning.
Huge, because online learning isn't just about passively watching or reading. It's about talking to other people, sharing ideas, working together.
Right.
And this research showed that online learning was becoming more learner-centered.
Interesting. What do you mean?
Learners had more power. They could control their own learning more, thanks to all these online communication tools.
So instead of the teacher being the only focus,
Yeah.
online learning gave space for learners to participate more.
Exactly. A key figure in this was Randy Barrison.
Garrison.
He argued that online discussions and collaborations were super important for the shift to learner-centered learning.
Yeah, online discussions can make people think more deeply. They get to share their perspectives and learn from each other. It's more engaging.
Absolutely. And while researchers were figuring out all the teaching stuff, some institutions were taking online learning to a whole new level.
How so?
John Daniel wrote this book called Mega Universities and Knowledge Media. He talked about the potential of these massive online learning places, like the British Open University.
So these were places embracing technology to reach way more students.
Yeah, they were breaking down barriers to higher ed, making it possible for people who couldn't go to a traditional university to get a degree.
Democratizing education.
Exactly. And that vision of using tech to make education more accessible, it was echoed in a big report from the U.S. Congress in 1998.
What report?
The Power of the Internet for Learning.
Catchy title.
Right. It was a call to action, basically saying, hey, policymakers, we need to support online learning. It can change everything. The report highlighted all these trends that were shaping the future of learning, like broadband expanding, pervasive computing, digital technologies converging, adaptive learning tools developing. It was exciting.
All these pieces coming together.
Right. And alongside all that, we see continued progress in specific areas, like mixed reality and distributed simulation.
Okay. Mixed reality. That's both VR and AR, right?
Yep. It was starting to be used in education and training.
So those early VR and AR experiments in the 80s were paying off.
Sort of. Adoption was still pretty limited, though, you know. The tech was expensive and complicated back then.
Makes sense. Those early systems were clunky and pricey. VR and AR have only recently become affordable and easy to use.
True. But even with those limitations, people were starting to see the potential. Imagine learning about history by actually being in ancient Rome, or learning anatomy by interacting with a 3D human body.
That would be amazing. It's like learning by doing, but on a whole other level.
And while that was happening, distributed simulation was also making progress.
Building on that SimNet foundation from the 80s.
Exactly. Developers created new standards, like DIS and HLA. These let different simulation systems talk to each other.
So you could have more complex and realistic training scenarios.
Exactly. Super important for organizations like the military who rely on simulations to train people for high-stakes situations.
It's incredible how far simulation tech has come. And then there's the Advanced Distributed Learning Initiative.
ADL.
ADL came out of the military's push to use technology for training.
It did. They wanted to make distributed learning more learner-centric.
So moving away from that old classroom-centered model.
Exactly, putting the learner in charge of their own learning.
Giving them the power to decide what, how, and when they learn.
Exactly. And to do that, ADL focused on developing technical standards for distributed learning, standards for sharing content, making sure things work together, exchanging data between different learning systems.
So not just inventing cool tech, but making sure it all works together.
Precisely, like building a well-oiled machine. And the development of standards like HTTP, HTML, and XML, it's super important. They made the web a platform for data-driven learning.
And all while the internet was changing, other technologies were also evolving, things that would have a huge impact on learning. Well, AI was getting smarter, data mining was taking off, natural language interfaces were getting better, and mobile devices were entering the scene.
All those things opening up even more possibilities for personalized and accessible learning.
Exactly. We even see DARPA developing this system called Pilots Associate.
Pilots Associate.
It used AI and cognitive modeling to help pilots make decisions.
So like a virtual co-pilot.
Yeah, basically. And all this tech progress was partly because of what we were learning about the human brain.
Right. The 90s were the decade of the brain. There was a ton of research on cognition and neuroscience.
Leading to better learning technology.
Exactly. It was setting the stage for an even bigger decade. The 2000s, mobile devices, broadband access, social media, it all came together to revolutionize distributed learning.
The 2000s, that's when mobile learning really took off, and online learning platforms became mainstream. It's amazing how much happened so fast. I'm ready to hear about what went down in the 2000s and beyond. The 2000s, it feels like that's when technology really started to change everything.
Yeah, it did. The 2000s were like this perfect storm of tech advancements. They completely changed how we learn and get information.
Like what specifically? I'm trying to remember what it was like.
Well, broadband was getting faster. Smartphones were everywhere. Streaming video was taking off. E-readers were becoming a thing. Social media was connecting everybody.
You're right. It all happened so fast.
And it all created the perfect environment for new learning technologies. And one of the biggest, mobile learning.
Oh, yeah. M-learning.
Yeah.
Suddenly we could learn anywhere, anytime on our phones. It was a game changer.
Totally. M-learning opened up so many possibilities, especially in developing countries, places where people couldn't always get to a school.
It helped level the playing field a bit.
Yeah, it did. And it also changed things in industrialized nations, you know? We started seeing more context-aware and pervasive learning.
What's that?
Like instead of just reading about historical landmarks in a book, you could be standing right there in front of them, getting info on your phone.
Oh, right.
Or imagine a mechanic who can pull up a training video right there while they're working on a car.
Wow. Yeah, that's powerful. Makes learning so much more relevant.
Right. And this often went hand in hand with microlearning.
Microlearning, bite-sized learning for our short attention spans.
Exactly. Breaking down complex topics into little chunks so they fit into our busy lives.
Makes sense. While all that was happening, regular online learning was growing too. E-learning was becoming the norm in schools and businesses.
Yeah, you had the big commercial learning management systems like Blackboard and WebCT, but open source platforms like Moodle and Sakai were gaining ground too, more affordable, customizable.
So lots of options for online learning.
And with all these systems and content creators popping up, we needed standards.
Standards, like rules.
Yeah, rules for how everything works together. So we had things like Lozone, Dublin Core SCORM. They made sure different systems could talk to each other and share content.
So it's like making sure everyone speaks the same language.
Exactly. Otherwise, it's just chaos.
Right.
Yeah.
Makes sense. And then we have this idea of instructional objects.
Instructional objects, reusable learning materials. You can mix and match them to create different learning experiences.
Like educational building blocks.
Exactly. And to make it easier to find and share all these learning materials, we had initiatives like Cordra and Merlet.
Cordra Merlet, okay.
They created these big libraries of learning objects that teachers and students could access from anywhere.
So anyone could get access to good learning materials.
Exactly. And this leads to the Open Educational Resources movement.
OER, right? Open access to knowledge for everyone.
Right.
I love that.
Me too. The OER movement was all about making education free and available to everyone. Creative Commons was huge for this. Their open licenses made it possible to share and reuse learning materials without all the legal headaches.
And we can't forget Wikipedia, The ultimate example of open knowledge.
Right. It shows what happens when people work together to build something amazing.
And while all that was happening, MOOCs were starting to emerge.
Massive open online courses.
Yeah. They didn't really explode until later, but the early ones popped up in the late 2000s. Platforms like Udemy and peer-to-peer university.
They offered free online courses to tons of people. It was a big deal.
They really shook things up in higher ed.
For sure. They promised to make education accessible to anyone with an internet connection, and they were often based on connectivist learning theory.
Connectivist learning.
It's all about social learning, collaboration, network knowledge, learning together as a community.
Okay, so those early MOOCs were different from the ones that came later.
Yeah, the early ones were more about collaboration and connection. Later on, they became more focused on reaching huge audiences and adopted a more traditional teaching style.
So while all this cool stuff was happening with online learning and MOOCs, what was going on with the research side of things? The learning science?
Oh, tons of stuff. Researchers were making big progress, understanding how the brain learns, developing new theories, testing things out in studies.
So the science was catching up with the technology.
Exactly. And this research was happening everywhere. Some people focused on general learning principles, others looked at specific subjects. It was all about figuring out how to create the best learning experiences.
And then there's cloud computing.
Yeah.
That's when things really exploded, right?
Oh, yeah. Cloud computing changed everything. It made it possible for MOOCs and other online platforms to handle huge numbers of learners.
Platforms like AWS and Azure made it so much easier and cheaper to run online courses.
It's like having a giant data center that you can access from anywhere. And it also paved the way for the Internet of Things.
The Internet of Things, like connecting everything to the Internet.
Exactly. Your fridge,
Yeah.
your car, your thermostat, everything. And this opened up all sorts of possibilities for learning. Imagine learning about a car engine by interacting with a virtual model that's connected to a real car.
That'd be so cool.
And then you had wearable tech. Some of them had sensors to track things like heart rate and eye movements.
So you could see how people were reacting physically to learning.
Yeah. But it was still early days. There were challenges with the data. And then in research labs, you had all these new brain imaging techniques.
Wow.
It was like peeking inside the brain, seeing how it learns in real time.
Incredible. And some researchers were even using video feeds from smartphones and laptops to track emotions.
Trying to build systems that could respond to how you're feeling.
Like a computer that knows you're frustrated and tries to help.
Exactly. And then there's DARPA, always pushing the boundaries. They were exploring neural interfaces.
Neural interfaces.
Like connecting your brain to a computer.
Ooh, that's getting into sci-fi territory.
It is. But it shows how far we've come. And with all this data flying around, we had a new problem. Data smog.
Data smog.
Too much data. It was overwhelming. We needed new ways to manage it and make sense of it.
Right. So what did we do?
Well, the ADL initiative came up with XAPI, the Experience API.
XAPI. Okay.
It was a standard way for different systems to share data about learning experiences. So your LMS, your phone, your wearables, everything could talk to each other.
Like a universal translator for learning data.
Exactly. And XAPI was a big part of the Total Learning Architecture, or TLA. The idea was to connect all these separate learning technologies into one big system.
So you could get a complete picture of a learner's journey.
Right. But even with all this innovation, there was still the problem of cost.
Yeah. All this fancy tech is expensive.
It is, especially the stuff with AI and personalized learning. So the challenge was how to make it more affordable. Crowdsourcing and machine learning were promising approaches.
So using the power of the crowd and machines to make things cheaper.
Exactly. And you see this with projects like the Army Research Laboratory's GIFT initiative.
GIF.
It was all about building cheaper and more effective intelligent tutoring systems, using open source tools and getting the community involved.
So anyone could contribute.
Yeah, it was about democratizing access to this technology. And then as we move into the 2010s and now, everything we've talked about, it keeps evolving. MOCs are changing, new platforms and technologies are emerging, and we're still trying to figure out how to make learning more affordable and effective for everyone.
It's been a wild ride. From those early days with Saki and Plato
Yeah.
to the incredible learning ecosystems we have now. And it's clear that this is just the beginning.
Right. Who knows what the future holds?
Exactly. That's what's so exciting. It's a constant evolution.
Yeah.
So what does all this mean for learners today?
It means you have more options than ever before. You can learn from anyone, anywhere. You can personalize your learning. You can connect with people from all over the world. It's an amazing time to be a learner.
It is, but it also means you have to be smart about it. You have to choose your learning carefully. You have to engage with the material and with other learners. You have to think critically.
It's not just about consuming information, it's about making connections, asking questions, being curious.
The future of learning is in your hands.
That's a great way to put it.
Well, this has been quite a journey. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the history of distributed learning.
It's been my pleasure.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.